Hi everyone, thanks for joining us for this webinar on communications, a messaging deep dive. As you know, this is one of our installments of our monthly webinar series. Today we'll be joined by Michelle Boykins, who's the Director of Strategic Communications for Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, and Meghan Maury, who's the Policy Director for the National LGBTQ Task Force. We'll be covering a variety of topics today, including the AANHPI messaging research on the 2020 census, as well as the Census Bureau's communications plan. For those of you who are joining us for a webinar for the first time, this is part of our series of monthly webinars on the census, which you can find on our website and also our blog. And then also next month, we'll be hosting a webinar on deep dive into the race and ethnicity question, and the invitation will be going out later this week, so stay tuned. At the end of this webinar, we will do Q&A. To ask a question, you can either type into the questions box on GoToWebinar, or you can raise your hand and we'll unmute you and you can ask your questions directly. So let's get started. I'll turn it over to Michelle Boykins, who's our Director of Strategic Communications.
Thank you, Bessie, and welcome everyone. I want to take you through our messaging research that we were able to conduct over the last few months with Lake Research Partners. We're very fortunate to have them help us with conducting this research. We did both, we did two phases of research, both focus groups and an online survey. And just wanted to quickly share with you what our research objectives were. Our goal was really to get the opinions of both citizens and non-citizens living here in the U.S., make sure that we had a really good swath of Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, Native Hawaiians involved in this research. And we focused in on our two phases, doing 10 focus groups. As you can see on the screen, we did them in a variety of different languages. And then we conducted a nearly 1,600 online survey with adults nationwide. We oversampled to make sure that we could include Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders within our research. And we had 1,590 respondents in our online survey. And a majority of the respondents were immigrants themselves, so first generation. There were also about a quarter who have an immigrant parent, so second generation, and the rest were with U.S. born parents, so third generation. And as you'll see from this next demographic profile slide, it shows you the the breakout of who we spoke to within the online survey. So you get a really good sense of gender, of age, education, employment status, ethnicity, and region of the country. So I'm going to try to take you through some of the highlights. There's a lot of information that we're still digesting and going through, and we'll do our best to try to break out any additional things that we see by ethnicity or by region of the country that we think will be really helpful to all of you when you're looking to implement things locally. And we'll have some things that we'll share with you, some fact sheets, some other information through our communications channel. So please stay tuned to hear more as we uncover all that is within this research. So participation in the census. Let's start by getting a snapshot and understanding of where people are in terms of their knowledge of the census. So, over 87% of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders have heard of the U.S. Census, but unfortunately, half of them haven't heard about the upcoming 2020 census. So that lets us know that we have our work cut out for us in terms of boosting the knowledge that the 2020 census is coming. And a majority, over 52%, say they have participated in a census before, most of them have done so in another country. So again, this for a lot of people will be their first opportunity to participate in the census here within the U.S. And awareness of the census is high across the board. Interestingly, it's highest among Japanese Americans and Chinese Americans, as you can see here from this chart. 93% of Chinese Americans and 96% of Japanese Americans are aware of the U.S. Census. And 1 in 2 Filipino, Korean, and Vietnamese Americans said during our online survey that they have participated in a different country. And as you can see, 1 in 3 Indian Americans have also done so. And while a majority of men say they're almost certain to participate, women are a different, different scenario. There's also a similar gap by age. Younger Asian American and Pacific Islanders say they're much less likely to participate than those who were over 45. And folks in the West Coast area also indicating some hesitancy in participating. So as you can see, there's some critical gap in getting folks to not only know about the census, but also be willing to participate. So older APIs are more likely to have heard of the U.S. Census. Men in particular seem to be leading that group, with women, not too far behind. But again, you'll see throughout the survey that men tend to be the ones responding affirmatively, that they know about the census, they've heard about it, and are likely to participate. And then, not surprisingly, you'll see on this slide that first-generation immigrants are most likely to have participated in a census in another country. Hopefully this bodes well in terms of getting them to want to participate in the 2020 census and fill out the form. So nearly 3 in 5, so about 59% of women have said they've not heard anything about the 2020 census. And you'll see this as kind of a recurring theme throughout, that it seems that we're going to have to focus a bit on women in terms of raising awareness and encouraging them to participate. Third-generation immigrants are more likely to recall participating in a previous census, whether that's here in the U.S. or that their parents or grandparents may have participated in their home country. Less than half of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders know, though, that everyone in the country, regardless of immigration status, is required to participate in the U.S. Census. So this is a point where we're really going to have to hammer home and make sure that everyone knows that they have the right and the opportunity to participate in the census, no matter what their status is. And this is one of the reasons why it was important for us to ask folks who are both undocumented as well as folks who are U.S. citizens, because we felt that there could be a difference in terms of knowledge and information about the census based on their mixed status or the status within their household. So this is something that we really need to keep an eye on and make sure that we're doing a good job of letting everyone know that they should participate in the census. So Vietnamese Americans, you'll see on this in this particular slide, are less aware than anyone else that they're required to participate. So while Japanese and Chinese Americans understand that everyone's required to participate, Particularly, it seems that we have to do some outreach to Vietnamese Americans and make sure that they know and understand that everyone should participate in the U.S. Census. So now we'll take a closer look at some of the other findings that we have from the online survey before we dive into some of the specific messaging things that bubbled up from our research. So, again, knowledge of the 2020 census is highest among Asian Americans, but it is lowest among Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders. So, again, when we're looking at where are we going to need to focus some attention on the ground, and with our outreach, there's clearly a sense of Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders needing some additional outreach, some additional approaches with messaging. And Indian Americans, say that they're most likely to participate in the U.S. Census, as well as Chinese Americans and Japanese Americans. Vietnamese, Filipinos, and Native Hawaiians really seem a little less sure about whether they will participate or not. We'll talk a little bit about how some of those things change as you go through, as we went through the survey, and once you start to see some messaging, there is a little bit of a shift in terms of people who say that they're less sure about participating at the beginning of the survey to where they are at the end of the survey. So in terms of the next slide, participation, in the past U.S. Census is highest among Chinese Americans, Korean Americans, and Japanese Americans. A lot of them reported having participated in the 2010 census. So we at least have folks within the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander, group, the community at large, who have a knowledge and have participated before, so they understand a bit of, the importance of the survey, and that it's easier, for people to be able to complete. So here on this slide, one of the things that was very interesting, I think we expect people to say they don't want to have people come door to door to get their answers to the survey, but it did seem interesting to us that also the option of completing the form in language seemed to have little impact on what option people would choose, whether they wanted the paper form or they wanted to do online. The idea of having it in language was something they definitely felt was important, and I'll focus on that in a couple more slides, but it was interesting that in language didn't really change whether or not they wanted the online option or the paper form, but it's very clear that the community is really interested in doing the paper form or the online option, and very few folks are interested in the door-to-door or the call-in options. And Vietnamese Americans are particularly interested in the option of completing the census online, which is actually the first time that the Census Bureau is offering that, is for the 2020 census. So, as early adopters of technology in the Asian American community, it seems that Vietnamese Americans are really interested in choosing that option. And then you'll see here as well, Japanese Americans and Chinese Americans are still preferring the paper form. So some of that comes from, wanting to have that kind of in language, back up with the English form, wanting to be able to make sure that, they don't make any mistakes on the form itself. So there's still a big trust in having the paper hard copy form versus doing something online. And as you might expect, this slide really wasn't, a revelation, but more of a confirming of what we would have expected, which is that older Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders want to have the paper form, while younger NHPIs prefer the online option. So, this just keeps us, reinforcing the fact that, the younger you are within the community, the more likely you are to want to use technology to complete the census. Now let's turn our attention to messaging and the advertising that we use to get folks' reaction to the census advertising. So what we were able to do is to use previous 2010 census ads, and we made sure to have a cross-section of ethnicities within the AANHPI community so that everyone would be able to see themselves in the advertising that was being tested. So at the beginning of the survey, if you identified as Vietnamese, then you were shown the Vietnamese ad only. If you identified as Indian American, and so forth. So any person who identified themselves within a particular ethnicity at the start of the survey was one given the survey in language if they opted to do so, and the advertising that they saw was in language as well if they opted for that at the beginning. So the ad, just so that we're clear about the copy, the ad says, help your community make sure everyone in your house gets counted. It's very important. The 2010 census form lets everyone in your family help improve schools, increase job training, and do a lot more for your community. By answering 10 simple questions and mailing the form back, you have the power to improve your community for generations to come. So as you can see, based on this, nearly 8 in 10 rated the advertising as convincing and as a convincing reason to participate in the census. So what this says to us is that this is still a viable message because, and you'll see this come up a little bit later, it hones in on some key things that were really important for the community to hear. But, this says that there's still an opportunity to use some of the messaging that was effective in 2010 and bring that into 2020 and still use that. So on this next slide, this lets you know a little bit about some of the, the open-ended responses that we received when asking people, what was it that, that really made this ad effective for you? And so, you'll see that, some folks said it just reminded them to participate, but others really appreciated having a multi-generational, multicultural family, being able to see people that looked like their real family, being able to see that diversity. For some, it was really important that it wasn't an actor or, a celebrity who's telling them to participate. It was someone that they could clearly see being from the community and within the community that they might live. It might be a next door neighbor, So having that kind of personal touch and seeing their own identity within the advertising really did seem to come across, as you'll see in in these different open-ended responses that we received. So then, in terms of the advertising, when you look at who really seemed to be most convinced by the advertising, it was Filipino and Vietnamese Americans. clearly you can see in terms of the convincing, most folks were above the 70% line. Only Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander fell just short of that 70% as convincing. And so, again, we've already identified that Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander, the community needs a little bit more outreach and a little bit more love and attention when it comes to talking about the 2020 census. So this again bears it out, but it also lets us know that if we keep within messaging like this for our 2020 census messaging, we're able to really resonate with people and capture people's attention. So in terms of the advertising, 2 and 3 folks would prefer an advertisement with diverse communities rather than just their own ethnic community. Now, this was something that was really interesting in the focus groups, was where this first surfaced, and it surfaced within the focus groups of people saying, I don't necessarily want to be singled out within my ethnicity. Why can't we be seen as part of the larger community? And then there were others who were, really happy, like Cambodians, for instance, saying it's really nice to be recognized and, and to see our own, ethnic community represented within the advertising. So, there's still a little bit of this dichotomy that you see here, where some want to be seen with Caucasians and African Americans and Latin Americans in the mix, and others who still go, I kind of prefer just seeing my own community. So, what this says to us really is that there's still a need for kind of a mixture of advertising. Not every community is going to be able to be, approached with the same ad. So, we have to be prepared to have a variety of different advertising and some different approaches in the marketplace in order to really reach everyone effectively. So here you see nearly half of APIs, saying that, this advertisement with the language about community and that really makes them more likely to participate. And, we were really happy to see that. But similarly, there's also 43% who say that doesn't really have an impact, on their participation. So the in language is really, interesting. It seems to have slightly more power with men and third generation Asian Americans, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islanders than it does with younger generations. So, so there's still a little bit of, almost like with the online versus paper form, there's a little bit of that older generation versus younger generation in terms of the need for in language. So there's still very clearly a need for in language advertising, especially when you look at Vietnamese Americans and Indian Americans. They still rate that as really high on increasing their participation, but across the board, there is some, interesting things going on here where we see that not everybody feels the need to have it in language in order to increase their willingness to participate in 2020 census. So, in terms of, the paper form and what is most likely going to get people to, to participate in the census, this was really, really interesting, because I thought for sure something like, social and, social media and, newspaper advertisements or something like that was going to really rise to the top, but people still seem to prefer getting something in hand, mailed to their home, encouraging them to participate in the census. And that really was across most of the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities. So, so it really, it really was interesting to us to see that television didn't rate, as high. It was, right there in second place, but, television and online, something that we were thinking would really bubble up to the top, really didn't. And, and then both men and women seem to rate the mailed advertisement as something that would most likely increase their participation, again, followed by television. And, and that was pretty much equal in terms of gender with men and women. And then, not surprising to us, is online ads tend to be, one of the best mediums for younger Asian Americans, Native Americans, and Pacific Islanders. So, so again, we kind of see that split. So what that says to us is that we have to use multiple media to be able to reach the entirety of the ANHPI community. All right. So now let's talk in terms of messaging, some of the big things that we found within the online survey. And these things really did also bear out, when looking at the the focus groups as well. So when you focus in on family, and you focus in on, bringing resources to the community to help your family, and you couple that, and we'll isolate the children piece in a minute, but when you focus in on that idea of the census will help your family, and then it's going to bring resources that help your family, that was a very convincing message for people. All three of the top reasons to participate in the census really tested well among the different communities, particularly with Filipinos, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islanders. Family tested really strong. The versions where you add children into the mix tend to, to create some differences in terms of, how strong people feel about, the message once you involve children. But it clearly lets us know that any message that talks about family, talks about bringing resources, to the family, to the community, are going to be really well received almost universally across the board. So two of the top three reasons for participating in the census, from the online survey, and, some of this bore out in the focus groups, but it really came through very strongly here in the online survey. It's about making sure that the AANHPI community gets the resources that are needed. And it's important as well, equality, being an American, being counted, civic duty, and having a voice, within the census are important, but none of them rose to, that level of my community needs resources. This is important for my family. When we're all counted, when we get the resources that we need. Those really, really were strong, readings on the scale. And, some of these other messages were ones that moved certain, groups of people within our online survey, but above and beyond, having family, community, and getting resources mixed into the messaging really was a strong indicator that people would participate and that people would be motivated by the message. So as you can see here, the family message really resonates, amongst the Indian and Vietnamese Americans, but they prefer that it's coupled with children. So, talking about my family, my children getting the resources for school, my community getting the resources that it needs, are all really important. And coupling that, making sure that you focus in on children, really did make a difference for the Indian and Vietnamese Americans. And then for Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders, talking about visibility, which is, something that really was a mixed bag in the focus group research, tended to come out really strong for this community here, as did it for Vietnamese Americans. It was another message that, was really well received, talking about being visible, being counted, being heard, was important. So, you'll see that when you add children into the mix, Indian and Filipino Americans, they had some different preferences in terms of how that, message should come across to them. But, but it was interesting to see that those who shifted towards becoming more likely to complete the census in the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander really felt like saying, my voice needs to be heard, and connecting that to getting resources for the community were really strong message points for them, and shifted their belief that they would participate in the 2020 census. And one thing also I think that was really interesting in terms of when we were looking at messaging is, one of the things that, we kind of thought would play well, especially, given the current environment, is the idea of political representation. The idea that, the census has a direct impact on, your representation locally and local government. And it did not seem to be important, as important across the board as, as the resources message for community and for family. And it was least important among those within the community, within the NHPI community, that we would consider, swing voters, independent voters, people, who haven't necessarily picked a party line. And, the idea of political representation just did not seem to come across as strongly as we thought. So that was something that was very interesting, for us to see show up in the survey, when if we had just, gone without having survey results, we might have thought that was a point to keep hammering home for people. And so the children-focused version of family, so this is where the message combines both talking about family and resources for your children, really tested well among women and those who were under 45. So, I've said already at least once or twice that women are a really, important part of the messaging outreach that we have to do. And, throughout all of this research, it's very clear that women, and also those women who are under 45, are very important to, raise awareness and encourage participation in the census. And those who were most likely to move towards participation after messaging, that children-focused message was very effective for women, convincing them to want to participate in the census. All right, and this slide here just gives you a little sense of the regional variations, and we're looking at right now trying to maybe pull this out and look at regional variations in a fact sheet or something like that, so that that's a piece that may be able to help all of you as you're looking at your local outreach in your area. When we were doing the focus groups, it was very clear that, messaging about, standing in solidarity, being counted, being visible, having a voice were really strong in, in the West Coast part of the country, really strong, in the Upper East, like in New York and so forth. Those messages were really, really strong. In others, it was seen as a little too overpowering, a little too much for for folks in other parts of the country. And so here you see some variation in terms of, the messages and kind of where the strength of those messages were in terms of region. So we see that NHPIs in the West and the South seem to become more likely to participate in the next census, in the 2020 census, once they have heard messaging, about their community, about family, about their kids, and getting more resources that are needed within the community. They tend to be, much more likely to want to participate. Those in the Northeast, some of those other messages tend to not really, change their mind in terms of whether or not they're going to participate. So, kind of getting them and capturing them at the beginning of, of messaging and outreach and awareness is really going to be important, because there's not as much, regionally that's going to move them if we don't capture them with, with our upfront messaging. And then in terms of some key takeaways, so I want to make sure we have plenty of time for it. Meghan, I'm going to go through these next couple of slides, quickly, but, clearly we have some work to do on, raising awareness of the census, letting people know that the 2020 census is coming, and, boosting participation. We, expected, and we know that it's, difficult to count the communities as it is. And so we really have to do our due diligence on, making sure that people know that the census is coming, and that they know that they should participate, and everyone should participate in the census. And then, you'll see in terms of, again, the preferences for online and mail options to complete the census are really important to the community. We saw it in the focus groups. It was very clear here that, that those two options really outweighed any of the other options, and it's not terribly surprising for the community that folks would not want to have people go door to door. Again, when you consider that we talked to folks who were, U.S. citizens and mixed status families, undocumented, that idea of people coming door to door was a really daunting thing, and folks really did not want to see that happen. So one thing that really popped up strongly in our focus group messaging, research was this idea of how's the Census Bureau going to protect people's information? They were concerned about data breaches and concerned about confidentiality and, and the security of their answers. And then, interestingly, when we got to this point of doing the online survey, that seemed to be less of a concern. Now, in fairness, when we were doing the focus groups, that was around April timeframe, like March, April timeframe, and that was where there was a lot of talk about data breaches. There, there was, Facebook testifying on the Hill, and, and there was a lot of talk about, how do you keep information private and secure. So, it's likely that we saw some of that come through in the focus groups because that was, national news and kind of top of mind for everyone at that time. Now, when you fast forward to, several months later, it doesn't seem to be as much of a concern, overall within the online survey, but it still shows up as a concern. People want to know, is this information going to be kept confidential? If I'm doing this, forum online, how's it being secured? So there still is some of that concern, but it just did not show up as strongly as it did earlier in the year. And we know, based on, testing the previous advertising, that we really have some strong, messaging that we can fall back on. We know that depicting multiple generations of families together, or, mixing people in with, multicultural community members really does, tend to rate strongly within the ANHBI community. And that, having in-language advertising, does, particularly have some power for certain groups, certain ethnicities within the community, but does not seem to be a powerful motivator across the board in terms of whether or not it makes someone participate. So, so it's helpful to know that that's not a barrier, that we have to worry about, but it can be an enhancement, it can be a plus to certain communities that we're speaking to. And, again, just in terms of messaging, it's important to hammer this home that, getting an equal and fair share of resources for the community, for your family, and talking about your family as focused both, with children is going to be a really strong motivator. It tests really well, and it tends to shift people, particularly women, into saying that they are, are more willing to participate once they understand that. And those who shift in positive direction after hearing the messaging and seeing the messaging, again, tend to be women and those under 45, and also tend to be Chinese Americans, which is interesting too. So when we're looking at where our targets are and who we need to focus in on, I don't think I can say enough that women are going to be very key, and folks who are under 45 are going to be very key to boosting participation in the census. And then lastly, I think that, looking in terms of where people are more likely to get information about the census was an interesting takeaway for us as well. People were more likely to say they pay more attention to hearing from friends and family and English language news media, and we're not as interested, in just hearing strictly from news media. They really needed to also hear that from friends and family. So people in the community are going to be a really big part of your push as well. So, that word of mouth, that talking, in different places, thinking about different ways that you can get the message out, at community meetings and so forth, really do seem like it's going to have an impact on raising the visibility of the census and raising people's, desire to participate in the census as well. Any message that highlights helping your community get its fair share, helping your community get the resources and government services that it needs, helping make sure that your family and your children are getting what they need in terms of resources are huge points, huge messaging points that we cannot overlook. So they tested really strongly throughout both the focus groups and the online survey, and clearly show that their motivator, not just from the beginning when you're raising awareness about the census, but also getting over any barriers that people might have to participating in the census. It becomes a really critical message to combine those and talk about the importance of getting those resources for your family, for your children, for your community. So with that, I'll stop and make sure we get a chance to hear from Meghan. Bessie, did you?
Yeah, so we did have 3 questions come in during the presentation, so we can ask them now.
Sure.
Number 1, since women are counted more accurately than men across all demographic cohorts, for example, age, race, ethnicity, owner versus renter, it's interesting that men say they are more likely to participate in the census than women say they are, at least at this point in time.
Mm-hmm.
Michelle, what do you think accounts for that disparity among AA and HPIs?
Mm-hmm.
This question is from Terry and Lowenthal.
Oh. It really was interesting. I don't know that, that we're able to figure that out from this survey that, some of it could be, and I'll say this, so forgive anybody who's on the phone who's male, but, the researchers did say, there could be a little bit of that, kind of machismo coming in saying, yes, I know about the census, even if they don't, because they don't necessarily want to, to look like they're uninformed and unaware. So there could have been a little bit of that crept in, particularly on the focus group side, I think less on the online survey side of things, but it's a really interesting thing to think about that, women just seem to, to not be as high in terms of, awareness and, and participation as men in this, in the study. And as you can see, it was almost equal in terms of, the men and women that we surveyed. So, so we'll try to look into that a little bit more, if there's anything else that we can dig out from, the research, from any open-ended questions or anything like that. But it might be more difficult to try to ferret that out from the research that we did.
Thank you. And another question from Terry and Lowenthal. Who created the 2010 census advertisement shown with question 15? Was it the Census Bureau or Advancing Justice AAJC or another stakeholder organization?
It was actually the Census Bureau. We wanted to make sure that we took something that the Census Bureau had done and take a look at that. Now, within the focus groups, we did also show them some of our advertising that Advancing Justice AAJC had done, but it was really clear from the focus groups that we didn't necessarily need to have additional sets of material, because having that one advertisement seemed to do enough in terms of the messaging that we were hoping, to get across to folks. Really seemed to come through with that.
I would also add that in 2010, the Census Bureau was working with a subcontractor for our community, IW Group, which is a multicultural marketing agency. And then lastly, a question from Deborah Stein. Did you test any messages about counting all your children?
We did not, say explicitly counting all your children. We did say counting children in your household. So, so we didn't make sure to be that specific and that explicit, within there. But, clearly within the focus groups that, it was understood that when you're talking about, children, that they got that it meant all children within your household. There were still some in certain ethnicities who didn't understand that also meant, children under 5. So, it's important to continue to say that you need to count all children. And we do know that we have some outreach materials that we're going to do that focuses in on that message. So we make sure we have that for the community as well.
Great, thank you. So next we'll turn it over to Meghan Maury, who is the Policy Director for the National LGBTQ Task Force. And Meghan will be telling us about a deep dive into the Census Bureau's communications plans.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you so much for all this research. It's so phenomenal. It's really incredibly useful and helpful. Thanks for having me on the call. I'm, as we already discussed, I'm the Policy Director for the National LGBTQ Task Force. But in addition to that, I get to chair up the Census Bureau's National Advisory Committee's Integrated Partnerships and Communications Working Group, which is a really long name for a little cohort of us that are really zeroing in on what the Census Bureau is doing to communicate to our communities over the course of the next 2 years. What I thought might be helpful for folks is to have some shared thinking together about how the Bureau's plans and timelines are, have some gaps that we might need to fill in, that there are some promising pieces, but that might need to be nuanced in response to this research and research done by other community organizations, and to maybe identify a couple of opportunities for us to push the Bureau to do a little better or to supplement the work that the Bureau is doing with our own work. So I started out just with this really simple graphic. I think when I first started doing this work, I was a little bit confused about what exactly the Census Bureau's Get Out the Count work looked like. And really, Get Out the Count is built into everything the Census Bureau does. It's built into how the survey is designed. It's built into how they do non-response follow-up for households that don't respond directly to the census. It's built into how the instructions are worded. But at this point in the census cycle, a lot of that has already been baked into what the Census Bureau has built over the last decade, with one glaring exception, of course, of the addition of the citizenship question, which was added in kind of at the last minute without any recognition of how it would impact Get Out the Count. But at this point, kind of where they're actively engaged in Get Out the Count efforts is through their communications and partnerships campaign. So I just put this up here to ground us in the concept that when we're talking about Get Out the Count and thinking about the vast resources that the Census Bureau can bring to bear on Get Out the Count for historically undercounted communities, we're really at this point talking most deeply about how they're doing communications and partnerships work. So if we pop into the next slide, the Census Bureau has a big plan in place for communications and partnerships, and some of it's great. There are some really positive elements baked into that plan, and I wanted to make sure we're grounded in those. So just like in 2010, the Census Bureau has subcontractors that will be focusing on historically undercounted communities. And that's great, because we know that when there is a person who is tasked with focusing on our communities, that a big organization or agency like the Census Bureau will do a better job speaking to us. But there's actually some kind of a downside to that too, in that when we look at the Census Bureau plans as they're laid out so far, they're based on some assumptions that don't really align with the research that y'all just presented on, right? So as a really simple example, most of the communication in the Census Bureau's Communications and Partnerships Plan focuses on the AA and NHPI community being really tech savvy and wanting to receive messages through social media. Whereas when you all did your messaging research, you found that that's not really the case. That's not as much the case as the Communications and Partnerships Plan puts forward. But I think that the great thing is that this research is coming out at a time when that plan can still shift. I do want to point out a couple of the other kind of strong points in the Communications and Partnerships Plan. They did do a really great job, I think, this time around, talking about how to focus on complete count committees and keep state and local engagement sustained over a long term. And I think the Census Bureau is doing some really great work around that right now. And I think there are some really cool tech things built into their communications and partnerships plan around using real-time response rates to the census to shift their communications and partnerships efforts within and among communities to make sure that they're reaching the folks that have not yet responded. So there are some really cool things built into the Census Bureau's plans. But of course, there are also some big areas of concerns. And if we go on to the next slide, I just laid out a couple of them here, and of course there are more. But one of the biggest things we see when we read through that communications plan is that while there's a specific focus on racial and ethnic groups and, in fact, LGBTQ groups, there is not an explicit focus on a lot of other historically undercounted groups that we know the Census Bureau needs to focus on in order to do the work well. So, for example, in this 180-something page plan, there's not a mention of how they're going to directly address the undercount of very young children, or the undercount of people experiencing homelessness or housing instability, or the undercount of migrants, whether they're documented or undocumented. So none of those communities that we know are unlikely to respond to the census are specifically addressed in the plan. And where our concern is that lack of attention to those communities is going to translate into a lack of focused communication when we get into 2019, 2020. The second really big sort of overarching area of concern that we see reading through the plan they have laid out now is that the timeline is incredibly condensed. Initially, after 2010, the Census Bureau and researchers looked back and they said, what did we do well? What did we do poorly? And each person said, what we should have really done is stretched out our communications timeline, spend more time investing in reaching and communicating to these communities that are historically undercounted. And so for 2020, what we should do is build in a longer timeline. That's great. I wish that it had happened that way, but the way that what we're looking at now is a much more condensed timeline that really is much more aligned with what they did in 2010. So they're not taking that lesson learned from 2010 and applying it in the way that we wish they would for 2020. And then I think the third really big overarching area of concern for me is that they tend to rely on these really rosy estimates of self-response and of whether or not communications will be effective for our communities. And particularly in light of the introduction of the citizenship question, I think those estimates that they were relying on that were already, to our minds, unrealistically optimistic are even more so given the current political climate. And I think the plan hasn't really been reworked to reflect that. So those are some big kind of areas of concern. And I want to dig in a little bit more on the next slide to that timeline piece. So if we look here, the Census Bureau has been doing research much like the research that we just saw presented to us from Advancing Justice AAJC, where they reached out to folks across the country and said, what's motivating you to fill out the census? What is a barrier to filling out the census? How do we shift what your feelings are about the census? They did a quantitative survey as well as a qualitative component with focus groups, just like the research we just saw. And that survey and focus groups wrapped up by the end of April 2018. So that already happened, but the information that they learned in those focus groups and through that survey has not been published yet. So people aren't able to use that information to create their campaigns that are either aligned with or supplementing the work of the Census Bureau. But where the real problem comes in is on the next slide. So this is the research timeline, but on the next slide, we've got the outreach timeline. Originally, again, we saw the Bureau was going to take, if you could go back one slide, to the one, perfect, excellent. We saw that the Bureau was originally intended to begin strategic early education, which is the phase of their outreach plan that most clearly focuses on hard to count or historically undercounted communities. They intended to originally to stretch that phase out to last an entire year. But because that research got pushed so far back, and because we don't have the detailed information from that research now, they won't be ready with the messaging tools until November, December of 2019. So that strategic early education phase, which is the phase where they build trust and focus on historically undercounted communities, will actually only be for about 2 months instead of that full year that they had originally planned, given their learnings from 2010. Then we move into the rest of their timeline, which is on the next slide, where in January they kind of switch from that focus on historically undercounted communities to an awareness phase where they're building awareness among the whole population. But we know when they focus on the whole population, they're mostly directing their messages at what they call the diverse mass, which is like everyone in the country, but that those messages tend to resonate more with the communities that are not the hard to count or historically undercounted communities. In March, April, they move into a motivation phase. In July of 2020, they move into a reminder phase. But all three of those phases, they have built to be responsive to those self-response rates on the census. So if we get high self-response rates on the census, they can shift their communications and partnerships strategy around to respond to that. Unfortunately, with the citizenship question, we're expecting lower self-response rates, so that those tools that they have built into the plan might not be as effective as we'd hoped. I do just want to touch for 1 second on the next slide about the partnerships plan. I just wanted to bring in that in addition to the communications work they're doing, they're also integrating their partnerships work with that. They've organized with some what they call Keystone National Partner Organizations. There's about 450 of those. This tells a little bit about how they chose those partner organizations. They're hiring partnership specialists in states and localities across the country, but they're hiring those in phases, and most of them won't be hired till late 2019. But they are deeply engaging with complete count committees, which is part of their partnerships work. So they are, I'd say that partnerships plan work is sort of growing during this year, but the communications work itself they're still in testing, they're still in research, they're still focusing on that. So I would say if we go on to the final slide, that some of the real opportunities that we see are right now at this moment is to engage in that partnerships work where the Census Bureau is investing a lot of resources right now. Take a seat at the table, join complete count committees in your state or in your city. Some cities have them as well. And use the Census Bureau resources that are flowing through those complete count committees to make sure that they're doing a better job of communicating with folks in your own community. The second is to really complement and supplement the Census Bureau outreach. We know from the research that we've heard today, as well as the plans that are laid out by the Census Bureau, that folks are going to need to hear from the trusted messengers that they and are going to need to hear messages that work for them. And the Census Bureau is not going to do all of that work. We know that to be true, nor are they always the trusted messenger, right? So based on the research we've heard today, we know that trusted messengers come from within our communities, that we might trust our friends and family more than we trust a message coming directly from the Census Bureau. But also at the same time, we need to be advocating for the Census Bureau to do more and do better for our communities. We saw some of the good work that they did in 2010 that's still resonating with folks. They should be building on that and doing more to reach out and connect with communities that are historically undercounted. So I'll leave it there and take any questions that folks have. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I'll just add that, as Megan mentioned, the Census Bureau is hiring partnership specialists. So for those of you who are interested, please definitely check out usajobs.gov and census.gov, because it's so important for the Asian American, Native, Hawaiian, Pacific Islander community to have partnership specialists that know how to reach our communities. And again, if you'd like to ask a question, you can go to the GoToWebinar tool and type your question into the question box, or you can also raise your hand and we can unmute your line so that you can ask the question directly. All right, it doesn't look like we have any questions right now, but if you find that after this webinar you have any questions, please feel free to email us and we can make sure we get you that information. On the slide in front of you is just a list of upcoming webinars that we have. In November, we'll have a webinar on a deeper dive into race and ethnicity, and the invitation for that will be going out later this week, and the webinar will be on November 15th. And then we also have webinars planned for the remainder of the year and into early 2019. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email us at census@advancingjustice-aajc.org. Thank you, Michelle and Megan, for your presentation today, and thank you to all of you for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.